In the final weeks of 1888, as New York City staggered beneath one of the harshest winters of the decade, the house of the Winthrop family prepared for a new addition, not a child, but a governess. The Winthrops were wealthy merchants who had made their fortune in shipping and textiles, and like many families of their class, they lived in a mansion near Washington Square, a home warmed by fireplaces, trimmed with velvet curtains, and filled with the ticking of imported clocks. Yet despite their comforts, there was unease in the household. The Winthrop children, 3 in number, were lively, talkative, and prone to mischief. Henry, the eldest at 12, loved to challenge authority with clever remarks. Clara, 10, had an imagination too large to be confined, inventing stories at the dinner table and interrupting her mother's society tales. And little Samuel, only 6, had a habit of singing loudly at any hour of the day, much to the irritation of the servants. Their parents, Robert and Margaret Winthrop, were increasingly embarrassed by this noise. Robert, who spent his days at gentlemen's clubs and business meetings, believed children should be trained to sit in silence as proper young heirs. Margaret, eager to preserve her reputation among New York's social elite, feared that unruly children would be taken as a sign of poor breeding, and so, after many complaints, they resolved to hire a governess, someone strict enough to impose discipline where they could not. It was through a cousin in Boston that the name Agatha Wells arrived. She is a most unusual governess, the cousin wrote, firm, uncompromising, and utterly devoted to order. Her methods may seem severe, but they are effective. I assure you, the children will be tamed. The cousin, however, said nothing of her appearance, nor of the whispers that followed her employment in other homes. The Winthrops, weary of childish laughter, accepted the recommendation without hesitation. A letter was sent, and within the week, Agatha Wells agreed to come. On the morning of her arrival, a carriage stopped before the Winthrop mansion. From it descended a tall woman wrapped in a black woolen cloak. The driver set down her trunk, worn and heavy, and quickly departed without a word, as though relieved to leave her behind. When she removed her bonnet inside the foyer, the Winthrops received their first shock. Her scalp was bare, smooth and pale with no trace of hair. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, giving her an unnatural, almost spectral look. Clara gasped before she could stop herself, and little Samuel whispered, "She looks like a ghost." Agatha's eyes were small but piercing, set beneath thin brows. Her mouth was a thin line, her skin tight against sharp cheekbones. Though her face was severe, she bowed politely to Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop. Her voice when she spoke was calm and measured, without warmth. "I am Miss Agatha Wells. I believe we shall make fine progress with your children." Robert Winthrop was impressed by her composure. "Discipline," he declared, "is precisely what this house needs." Margaret, though unsettled by Agatha's boldness, found reassurance in her manners. The governess carried herself with the authority of a woman who tolerated no nonsense, and Margaret hoped that society would at last stop whispering about her wild brood. They welcomed her warmly, assuring her she would have full authority in the nursery and dining hall. "We only ask," Margaret added delicately, "that the children be taught silence and obedience." Agatha's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile, though it held no joy. "Silence," she repeated softly. "Yes, I understand." From the first moment, the children felt a chill around her. Henry, usually bold, avoided her gaze. Clara clutched her brother's arm, whispering that the governess's head reminded her of a polished skull. Samuel hid behind a chair, peeking out nervously. Agatha wasted no time establishing her rule. She ordered the children to stand before her in a line, their hands folded. She looked at each in turn, as though measuring not just their behavior but their very worth. "You will not speak unless I permit it," she said. "You will not fidget, you will not whine, and you will not disobey. If you do, there will be consequences. In my care you will learn the virtue of silence." The children nodded, though their throats were dry with fear. By evening, the household staff were already murmuring about the new governess. The cook said her eyes followed like needles. The maid claimed she never heard the woman's footsteps on the stairs. One footman swore that as she passed through the hallway, all the lamps flickered at once. But none dared speak openly against her, for Mr. Winthrop had made it clear, "Miss Wells is to be respected. She is here for the good of the family." That very night, at the first supper under her supervision, Agatha enforced silence. Clara began to ask for more bread, but Agatha's hand shot out and gripped the girl's wrist with startling strength. Not a word, she hissed. Clara recoiled, her appetite gone. Henry glared but said nothing. Samuel, on the verge of tears, stifled his sobs until his face turned red. Robert and Margaret, oblivious, praised the quiet. Remarkable, Robert said with satisfaction. Already, they are learning. But the children knew better. They knew the silence at that table was not peace, it was fear. Thus, the bold governess entered the Winthrop home. She brought with her not care, but control, not guidance, but suppression. The parents saw discipline, but the children saw something darker. An intruder who sought to strip them of voice and joy. What began as the solution to a family's embarrassment would soon become a nightmare of hunger and silence, teaching all who heard the story a painful truth. When authority is handed over without question, cruelty can enter a house dressed as discipline. From her first week in the Winthrop home, Miss Agatha Wells revealed that her most powerful tool was not the cane, nor the scolding tongue, but hunger. Where other governesses might impose chores or lessons as punishment, she used the dining table itself, the heart of any family, as a place of control and fear. The Winthrop children soon learned that every crumb of bread, every sip of milk, was conditional. Their very survival depended on silence. It began on the second evening. The children gathered at the long oak dining table, plates set before them with the usual roast and bread. Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop had gone to attend the opera, leaving Miss Wells in charge of supper. Clara, the 10-year-old with bright eyes and a restless imagination, forgot herself. She began telling Samuel a story in whispers, inventing a fairy queen who lived in the curtains. Agatha's bald head turned slowly toward her. "Children do not chatter at the table," she said flatly. Then to the maid, "Remove the child's plate." Clara gasped as her supper was carried away untouched. She tried to protest, "But I am hungry," yet Agatha's eyes narrowed. "And now, because you have spoken again, you will have nothing until morning." The others sat frozen. Samuel's fork hovered in midair. Henry clenched his fists beneath the table, but no one dared speak. Clara's stomach growled in the silence, but she ate nothing that night. By the third night, the lesson was clear. Words meant hunger. When Samuel hummed softly to himself, Agatha tapped the table sharply and ordered his bread removed. When Henry muttered that the potatoes were cold, his plate was cleared away entirely. "Silence," she would say, her voice calm but absolute. "Silence is discipline. Discipline is virtue." The children began to sit in terror, barely breathing as they ate. They chewed slowly, carefully, afraid that even the sound of a spoon scraping might be judged too loud. Supper became not nourishment, but a test of obedience. Agatha soon refined her cruelty. She would place food before the children, but ration it in small, humiliating portions. If they displeased her, she would remove not just the plate, but even the smallest crust. On one occasion, Samuel, desperate with hunger, reached for a roll without waiting for permission. Agatha snatched it away and placed it back in the basket, untouched. "Greed," she declared, "is the vice of the undisciplined." The boy cried quietly into his sleeve as his stomach twisted in pain. The worst was when she allowed the children to watch her eat. She would cut a slice of bread, butter it slowly, and chew deliberately while the children stared at their empty plates. Hunger became not only a punishment, but a spectacle, a reminder of her power over them. When Robert and Margaret Winthrop returned home from their evenings abroad, they noticed only the quiet. "Remarkable," Robert said after 1 week. "The children behave like angels." Margaret, sipping her tea, smiled. "At last, we have peace at the table." Agatha inclined her head modestly. "They are learning discipline," she said. The parents never asked why their children's cheeks grew thinner or why their laughter had vanished. They mistook silence for good breeding, never guessing that it was purchased with hunger. The cruelty deepened until one evening Clara fainted at the table. She had been denied supper 3 nights in a row for chattering during lessons. Her small body, weakened, could bear no more. She slumped sideways in her chair, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Samuel screamed, but his voice was cut short by Agatha's sharp command, "Quiet." Henry rushed to his sister's side, shaking her shoulder. She did not stir. Agatha did not allow panic. Instead, she ordered the maid to fetch water. "This is what comes of disobedience," she declared coldly, even as the children stared at her in horror. When Clara awoke a few minutes later, weak and pale, Agatha allowed her no food, only a cup of water. Henry seethed with anger, but he knew if he spoke, he too would be starved. Word of the governess's methods spread quietly among the servants. The cook confided to the housemaid that she had seen Clara's plate carried back untouched too many times. The butler muttered that he could not watch the children waste away, but none dared challenge Agatha directly, for she carried the authority of the parents. "If you speak against me," she warned one maid, "I will tell the mistress you are disloyal, and disloyal servants are easily replaced." The staff fell silent, just as the children had. Fear had spread beyond the nursery and infected the entire house. Weeks passed, and the children's frames grew leaner. Their once bright eyes dulled, their cheeks hollowed. Hunger became their constant companion, a gnawing ache that made even play impossible. Samuel dreamed of bread. Clara began scribbling pictures of fruit and feasts in her notebook, her only way of expressing what she dared not say aloud. Henry, though older, carried the heaviest burden. He knew that if he did not find courage, his siblings might not survive. At night, the children whispered secretly, their voices barely audible under the covers. They spoke of stolen apples, of sneaking to the pantry, of ways to defy the bold governess, but the fear of punishment kept them cautious. Agatha's bold figure haunted every corner, her shadow long even when she was not present. By using hunger as her weapon, Agatha Wells reshaped the very rhythm of the household. Meals, once moments of laughter and family, became trials of endurance. The table became a battlefield where silence was survival and obedience was measured in empty stomachs. The Winthrop children had been silenced not by wisdom or respect, but by fear of starvation. And though their parents praised the newfound quiet, the truth was darker. The cost of discipline had been carved into their thin faces and hollow eyes. Agatha believed she was teaching virtue, but she was only teaching despair, for hunger does not build character, it breaks it. By the second month of Miss Agatha Wells's tenure in the Winthrop home, silence had taken root so deeply that it seemed to seep into the very walls. The laughter that once echoed down the corridors was gone, replaced by a hush so heavy that even the servants tiptoed through their duties. The house, once alive with the energy of children, had become a tomb. Before Agatha's arrival, the Winthrop children had filled their afternoons with games. Henry would play marbles across the nursery floor. Clara would arrange dolls into kingdoms, inventing voices and songs for them. Samuel, the youngest, loved to run through the halls, singing at the top of his lungs until the butler scolded him. Now those sounds were gone. Henry kept his marbles hidden away, for Agatha had called them noisy trifles. Clara no longer told her dolls stories. Her dolls sat untouched on a shelf, collecting dust. Samuel had stopped singing altogether, for even the softest hum brought the threat of an empty supper plate. Instead, the three children sat side by side, motionless, reading the same lessons over and over. Their heads bent low, their lips sealed tight. They had learned that stillness was safety and silence was survival. The Winthrops had once prided themselves on culture. Margaret had hired a piano tutor, hoping Clara might play at social gatherings. But after Agatha's arrival, the piano lid remained closed. Clara's fingers itched to press the keys, but she dared not. Once, when she had timidly played a single note after lessons, Agatha appeared in the doorway like a shadow. "Music," she said coldly, "distracts the mind from discipline. Do not touch the instrument again." Clara never did. Dust gathered on the keys. The house, which had once carried the strains of practice pieces and childish laughter, now carried only the ticking of clocks and the faint creak of floorboards. The servants, too, fell under the governess's rule. The cook, who had once hummed while preparing supper, now moved about the kitchen in nervous quiet. The maids whispered only when sure that Agatha was not within earshot. Even the butler, a proud man who had served the family for decades, lowered his voice when reporting to the master and mistress. Agatha had become the unspoken authority of the household. Though the servants despised her, they obeyed, for she held the trust of Robert and Margaret Winthrop. And with the parents absent most evenings, there was no one to check her power. The staff began to say among themselves that the house had become cursed, that no child's laughter or servant's cheer could survive within its walls. They worked quickly and quietly, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere each night when their duties were done. The silence grew so profound that it felt unnatural. Guests who occasionally visited the Winthrops remarked on it. One aunt observed during tea, "The children are so, well-mannered now, but why do they not speak?" Margaret, pleased, answered, "Miss Wells has taught them discipline." The aunt smiled thinly, but she could not shake the strange chill of the house. It was the sort of silence that did not suggest peace, but oppression, a quiet maintained not by calm but by fear. Only at night, when Agatha retired to her own room, did the children dare to whisper to one another. Under the covers, with the curtains drawn, they shared secret words like contraband. "I dreamed of a feast," Samuel once whispered, his voice trembling with both excitement and fear. "Pies and cakes and so much bread." Henry warned him to keep his voice low, but Clara squeezed her little brother's hand. "One day," she said softly, "we'll eat as much as we want, and no one will stop us." Those whispered moments became their only refuge. Words which had been punished at the table became precious in the dark. They clung to one another, whispering promises and dreams, knowing that silence in the day could only be endured if they reclaimed their voices at night. Meanwhile, Robert and Margaret Winthrop mistook the silence for success. Robert often bragged to his colleagues that his children had finally learned the virtues of restraint. Margaret told her society friends that the governess was a blessing, the answer to their worries. "They sit so quietly now," she would say, sipping her tea. "One might almost forget there are children in the house at all." Her friends would nod politely, though some raised their brows. A house too quiet, they thought, was not a happy one. But Margaret ignored such doubts. She basked in the approval that discipline brought her. At times the silence grew so complete that even the children were frightened by it. Clara once said it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Samuel, too young to explain his fear, sometimes cried softly at night, not because of hunger but because the stillness was so unnatural. The house seemed to change with it. Shadows stretched longer, footsteps echoed louder, and every creak of the floor sounded ominous. To the children, the house no longer felt like a home but a prison, and at the heart of it all was the figure of Miss Agatha Wells, her bald head gleaming in the lamplight, her eyes sharp and watchful. She patrolled the house like a warden, ensuring that silence was absolute. The Winthrop home had gained its order, but at a terrible cost. The children's joy had been extinguished, their play erased, their laughter smothered. The servants worked under a weight of dread. The parents, blinded by their desire for appearances, celebrated what they thought was discipline. But silence born of fear is not peace, it is decay. The house itself seemed to wither beneath it, as though the very walls ached for the sound of life. Agatha Wells had turned hunger into a weapon, but silence was her triumph, and it was a silence that consumed everything. For weeks, Henry Winthrop had endured the iron rule of Miss Agatha Wells. At 12 years old, he was old enough to remember the laughter that once filled the house, yet young enough to feel powerless beneath the weight of her authority. He had watched his sister Clara faint from hunger, his brother Samuel cry himself to sleep, and his parents remain blind to it all. Each day, rage burned hotter in his chest. Henry had always been a spirited boy, fond of questions, jokes, and challenges. To him, the world was something to be tested, to be explored. But under Agatha's shadow, even his spirit had dimmed. He obeyed her rules in silence, his fists clenched under the table, his jaw tight as she snatched away food from his siblings. Yet with each injustice, he stored his anger like kindling, waiting for the moment when the fire inside him could no longer be contained. That moment came on a bitter December evening. Snow pressed against the windows, muffling the city's noise. The children sat at the long oak table, plates before them holding small portions of boiled potatoes and bread. Robert and Margaret were out again, attending a dinner party uptown, leaving Agatha in command. Samuel, only 6, had been unusually restless all day. His small body was gaunt from missed meals, and his stomach ached with hunger. As he lifted his fork, his hand trembled, and a sob escaped his lips. "I'm so hungry," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Agatha's bald head turned sharply, her cold gaze fixed on him. Without a word, she reached across the table, took his plate, and pulled it out of reach. Samuel began to cry openly now, his tiny fists rubbing at his eyes. Clara gasped softly, her own hunger forgotten as she reached for her brother's hand. Henry could endure no more. "Give it back," Henry said, his voice low but steady. The room fell silent. Clara's eyes widened in terror. Samuel's crying stopped in an instant, replaced by shock. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hush. Agatha's face darkened. "What did you say?" Henry's fists trembled on the table, but his eyes burned with fury. "You can't take everything from him. He's hungry. You can't do this." Agatha rose slowly, her thin figure looming over the table. Her shadow stretched across the children like a veil. "You dare speak to me with such insolence?" she hissed. "Disobedience will not be tolerated." Henry stood as well, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. For the first time in weeks, the sound broke the suffocating quiet. "I don't care. He's my brother. You won't starve him." Agatha's hand shot out, swift and sharp, as though to strike him across the face, but Henry did not flinch. He stood his ground, his chest heaving with anger. "You hit me if you want," he said, his voice cracking with both fear and determination. "But I won't let you hurt them anymore." Clara clutched Samuel, terrified, yet a spark of hope lit in her eyes. For the first time, someone had spoken aloud the words they all thought but dared not say. Agatha froze, her hands suspended in the air. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the boy. In that moment, she saw something she had not expected: resistance, defiance, courage. She lowered her hand slowly, her voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "You will regret this insolence." But the damage was done. The spell of silence had been broken. That night, Agatha withheld food from all 3 children as punishment. But Henry's defiance had planted something new among them, a seed of courage. As they huddled together in the nursery, stomachs aching, Clara whispered, "Henry, you were so brave." He shook his head, ashamed. "I should have done it sooner. I should have stopped her from the beginning." "No," Clara said firmly, her voice small but strong. "You gave us back our voices." Samuel, wiping his tears, nestled against his brother's arm. "You're my hero," he murmured before drifting to sleep. For the first time in weeks, the silence in the nursery did not feel suffocating. It felt alive with possibility, as though Henry's words had cracked open a door through which hope might enter. Agatha herself was unsettled by the boy's defiance. She had ruled many households through fear, but rarely had a child dared challenge her so directly. She paced her room that night, candlelight flickering against her pale scalp. The boy, she thought, he must be broken quickly or the others will follow. But even as she resolved to tighten her grip, a shadow of doubt crept into her mind. She had seen fire in Henry's eyes, a fire she feared might spread. In the days that followed, Agatha redoubled her discipline. She increased the punishments, shortened the meals, demanded even stricter silence. Yet something had shifted. The children no longer sat in perfect stillness. Henry's eyes challenged hers at every command. Clara hummed softly under her breath, daring to test the boundaries. Samuel clung to his brother, finding strength in his presence. The governess still held power, but her dominance no longer felt absolute. The silence she had built so carefully had cracked, and through the fissure, courage seeped like light. Henry's act of defiance did not end their suffering, but it ended their submission. For the first time, the children realized that Agatha's rule was not invincible. She thrived on silence, but one voice, brave enough to speak, was enough to unravel her control. In that dining room on that cold December night, Henry taught his siblings a lesson that would endure long after the governess was gone. Tyranny survives only as long as people remain silent. The moment someone dares to resist, the chains begin to weaken. The story of Miss Agatha Wells did not end with her dismissal from the Winthrop household. Though her bald figure disappeared into the shadows of New York City, the silence she left behind remained in the memories of the children she had tried to break. The scars of her rule were not on their skin, but carved deeper, etched into their spirits, shaping the way they understood authority, fear, and courage for the rest of their lives. Henry, Clara, and Samuel did not forget the long weeks of hunger and enforced quiet. For Henry, defiance had been the turning point, the moment he discovered that courage could topple even the cruelest tyrant. He grew into a man who valued truth over comfort, often speaking out against injustice even when silence would have been easier. The memory of standing up to Agatha gave him a strength he carried for the rest of his days. Clara, who had fainted at the table and seen her creativity crushed beneath Agatha's rules, found her voice again in time. As she matured, she poured her imagination into writing, filling pages with the stories she had once been forbidden to tell. She became a teacher known for encouraging children to speak, to sing, and to dream, determined that no child under her care would ever be silenced as she once was. And Samuel, the youngest, carried the most fragile scars. The memory of having his plate taken while his stomach growled haunted him for years. Yet it also taught him compassion. He grew up to run charitable kitchens in the city, offering food to the hungry, vowing that no child would know the pain of being punished with starvation as he had. Robert and Margaret Winthrop, too, were changed by the ordeal. At first, they had been blinded by the illusion of discipline, mistaking silence for virtue. But when the truth of Agatha's cruelty was finally revealed, when servants spoke and when their children's thin faces told the story better than words, they felt the crushing weight of guilt. Margaret wept for the nights her children had gone hungry while she entertained at society balls. Robert, proud and stubborn, struggled to admit his blindness, but he never again spoke so carelessly of proper discipline. Together, they resolved to be present in their children's lives, to listen, to watch, and never again to surrender authority so blindly. The Winthrops learned that wealth and reputation meant nothing if their children suffered in silence. They became quieter in society but warmer in their home, and in time their house regained the sounds of laughter it had once lost. As for Agatha Wells, she slipped into obscurity. Rumors said she sought work in other homes, but her reputation followed her like a shadow. Whispers of the bald governess carried through servants' networks, and few families dared to hire her again. She vanished from the city records in the early 1890s, leaving behind no family, no legacy, only the memory of fear in those she had ruled. But in a strange way, her cruelty ensured she would never truly be forgotten. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered among governesses, parents, and children alike. In New York circles, when children sat too quietly, someone might murmur, "Careful, or you'll end up with a Miss Wells in your house." The tale of the bald governess was retold for years, not as gossip, but as a moral parable. It carried a warning that silence is not always obedience and discipline without compassion is destruction. Teachers cited it when encouraging parents to nurture rather than suppress. Preachers spoke of it as an example of cruelty masquerading as virtue. Social reformers, campaigning against child labor and poor schooling, used it to remind their audiences that children's voices were too often ignored by those in power. Agatha's reign of silence, though short, became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority. It reminded people that cruelty often hides behind respectable masks, and that vigilance is the duty of every guardian. The most powerful legacy, however, came from the children themselves. Henry, Clara, and Samuel carried the memory into the next generation, teaching their own children never to accept silence born of fear. Clara would gather her students and say, "Your voice is precious. Never let anyone take it from you." Samuel, in his kitchens, often paused to kneel beside a hungry child, telling them gently, "You deserve to eat. Never believe otherwise." Henry, in debates and public meetings, would recall how fear had tried to silence him as a boy, and how speaking up had saved not just himself but his siblings. The Winthrop children transformed their suffering into strength. Where Agatha had tried to starve and silence them, they grew into adults who fed and encouraged others. The Winthrop house eventually regained its laughter, but the silence of those weeks was never fully erased. It lingered as a memory, a caution, an echo that reminded them always to guard against oppression. And so the lesson endured, that silence enforced by cruelty is not peace, but a warning sign. That discipline without love is not discipline at all. It is tyranny. That the courage to speak, even when afraid, can be the spark that saves lives. The bold governess disappeared into history, but her story outlived her. It became a quiet flame, passed from parent to child, from teacher to student, from reformer to audience. It is a lesson that endures even today, whispered whenever a child is silenced, whenever cruelty is mistaken for strength. True authority protects, it does not oppress. True discipline nourishes, it does not starve. And true silence, the kind worth seeking, is not the silence of fear, but the silence of peace, trust, and love.